For centuries, the question of Adam's identity has been largely shaped by Renaissance art, European theologians, and colonial-era doctrine. But what if we've been imagining him all wrong? What if the very first man was not white, as many Western images portray, but black? This question is not just about skin color. It's about reclaiming history, reinterpreting ancient texts, and challenging centuries of racialized theology. In this deep dive, we'll explore everything from biblical geography and Hebrew etymology to DNA evidence and ancient African traditions. This is the untold story of Adam, the man made from the soil, born in the sun-drenched cradle of civilization. The book of Genesis opens with a profound declaration that humanity was created in the image of God, Genesis 1 verses 26 to 27. It is a story many of us know by heart. Adam and Eve in the garden, the forbidden fruit, the fall from grace. But beyond the moral and spiritual teachings, some have looked deeper into the implications of this origin story. Could it have been used to define who belongs and who doesn't? Who is pure and who is other? For centuries, religious and political figures have interpreted the Genesis story through various lenses, sometimes theological, sometimes racial. In the colonial and post-colonial imagination, Adam and Eve were often depicted as European, setting an unspoken precedent about what original humanity looked like. The consequence? A theological underpinning to white supremacy and the marginalization of non-European peoples. These racialized interpretations weren't always explicit, but they were powerful. Paintings, sermons, schoolbooks, and catechisms subtly reinforced a worldview where whiteness was divine and other races were peripheral. Yet, there's nothing in the original Hebrew text of Genesis to suggest any racial identity for Adam and Eve. In fact, the name Adam is linked to adamah, the Hebrew word for ground or earth, indicating humanity's connection to soil, not skin. Some scholars also point out that Genesis 2 verse 7, which describes God forming Adam from the dust of the ground, emphasizes shared origin, not physical differences. Interestingly, ancient Jewish commentaries such as the Midrash do not mention race in their expositions of Adam and Eve. The focus was spiritual disobedience, not ethnic difference. So how did this sacred story, born from the ancient Middle East, become a blueprint for racial division? Genesis 9 verses 20 to 27 contains one of the most misinterpreted and misused passages in the Bible, the so-called curse of Ham. After the flood, Noah plants a vineyard, becomes drunk, and lies uncovered in his tent. Ham, his son, sees his father naked and tells his brothers. When Noah awakens, he curses not Ham, but Ham's son Canaan. Cursed be Canaan. The lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers. Genesis 9 verse 25. Over time, this passage was twisted into something far more sinister. By the Middle Ages, some theologians began to associate Ham with African peoples, and the curse as divine justification for their enslavement. This interpretation reached its peak during the transatlantic slave trade, where European colonizers and Christian missionaries alike preached that Africans were cursed by God to be slaves. But this interpretation is riddled with historical and textual errors. The curse was on Canaan, not Ham. There is no mention of skin color in the passage. The biblical Canaanites were Middle Eastern, not African. Furthermore, the Book of Jubilees and other ancient Jewish writings make no mention of the curse applying to African peoples. The association of Ham with blackness and slavery emerged primarily in European colonial theology, not in the ancient biblical world. Despite these facts, the curse of Ham doctrine became a core tenet in justifying slavery, segregation, and racial apartheid. It illustrates the power of narrative, how one misreading of Scripture can become a weapon for centuries. Even today, echoes of this false doctrine persist in certain theological circles. Understanding and deconstructing it is essential to healing the theological wounds of racism. Genesis did not emerge in modern America or medieval Europe. It was written and compiled in the ancient Near East, among peoples of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Canaan. These societies had complex identities, but their understanding of race was radically different from ours. In the ancient world, people identified themselves by tribe and kinship, who your family was, a language and land, where you came from and what tongue you spoke, religion and culture, who you worshipped and how you lived. There was no concept of race as a biological or skin color-based hierarchy. Diversity existed, but it was not organized into a pseudoscientific racial order. Skin color might be observed, but it wasn't codified into power structures the way it would be in the 17th to 19th centuries. We also know that ancient Israelites were in regular contact with Egyptians, Cushites, Ethiopians, and other African and Semitic peoples. In Numbers 12:1, Moses' marriage to a Cushite woman is mentioned. The reaction of Miriam and Aaron is not based on her race, but perhaps jealousy or other cultural reasons. God's response is telling. He defends Moses, not condemns his union. When the Genesis authors wrote about nations and lineages, they were engaging in an ancient way of explaining the world, not in racial classification but in genealogical and moral terms. The Table of Nations in Genesis 10 lists descendants of Noah's sons, mapping the world as the ancients saw it, not as a racial hierarchy but as a family tree. Understanding this helps us deconstruct modern racial interpretations of Genesis and opens the door to richer, more accurate readings. The answer is no. Race, as we understand it today, is a social and political construct. It was invented during the rise of European colonialism to justify conquest, slavery, and empire. The division of people based on skin color and the hierarchy of races is a modern ideology imposed retroactively onto ancient texts. In contrast, the Hebrew Bible presents a world divided by nations and families, not races. When it mentions different peoples, it usually does so in relation to geography, religion, or political conflict, not biological difference. So how did race become so embedded in biblical interpretation? It began in the Enlightenment era, when European thinkers started using biblical genealogies to trace the origins of races. They assigned the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth to different continents, Asia, Africa, and Europe. Ham was linked to Africa and cursed. Shem was associated with Jews and Semitic peoples. Japheth, the supposed ancestor of Europeans, was declared to dwell in the tents of Shem, Genesis 9 verse 27. An early theological assertion of European dominance. These interpretations were convenient for colonial powers and slave traders. They provided a divine order to justify exploitation. But none of this is inherent to the text. The Bible does not say that Ham was black or cursed. These were later interpretations built on biased worldviews. Absolutely. Many modern theologians, especially from marginalized communities, are rereading the Bible through liberatory lenses. Black liberation theology, first articulated by theologians like James H. Cone, interprets Scripture as a call for justice and resistance against oppression. From this perspective, Genesis isn't a blueprint for hierarchy, but a radical declaration that all humans are made in God's image, Genesis 1 verse 27. That divine image has no color, no caste, no superiority. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has long held traditions that emphasize the dignity of African peoples, tracing their lineage to biblical figures such as the Queen of Sheba, 1 Kings 10, and even the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8 verses 26 to 40. Churches and scholars are increasingly acknowledging the racist history of biblical interpretation and working to correct it. Some challenge long-held assumptions about whiteness in Christian art. Others emphasize that Jesus himself was a man of color from the global South. The goal isn't to discard Scripture, but to recover its deeper, inclusive meanings. From the Roman Empire to the American South, the Bible, especially Genesis, has been used to create and maintain power structures. But it has also been a source of inspiration for liberation movements. Enslaved Africans in the Americas drew strength from the Exodus story, Exodus 3 verses 7 to 10. Civil rights leaders invoked the Imago Dei to demand justice. Anti-apartheid activists in South Africa read Genesis as a call for unity, not division. So Genesis is a contested space, used for both oppression and liberation. Today, the legacy of racialized biblical interpretation still lingers. We see it in segregated churches, a religious nationalism, a racial biases within theological institutions. To move forward, we must critically examine how Genesis has been used and commit to more just interpretations. We must also acknowledge the prophetic voices, like Martin Luther King Jr., Desmond Tutu, and Sojourner Truth, who reclaim Scripture for justice. Many scholars now argue that reading Genesis through a racial lens limits its power. Instead, they suggest alternative interpretations. Ecological readings, emphasizing humanity's shared responsibility to care for the earth, Genesis 2 verse 15. Interfaith readings, highlighting themes of common ancestry and divine connection. Universalist readings, focusing on the idea that all humans are family. Jesus himself redefined the idea of family in the Gospels, saying, "Whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." Matthew 12 verse 50. These interpretations don't erase historical injustices, but they offer a path toward healing. Genesis can be a narrative of original sin, or a story of original unity. It can be about hierarchy or about sacred equality. The choice depends on how we read it, and why. Racism didn't start with Genesis, but it won't end unless we change the story. If we want a more just world, we must rethink the narratives that shape it. This means asking hard questions. How has your faith influenced your view of race? What interpretations of Scripture have you inherited? Which ones will you pass on? It also means creating spaces for a respectful dialogue, critical scholarship, cultural humility. Genesis doesn't have to be a story of division. It can be a story of connection, courage, and collective purpose. Let's choose that story. Share this video and continue the conversation. Comment below. How do you see race and religion intersecting? Read the resources in the description to go deeper. Use your voice to challenge injustice and reimagine faith for a more equal world. Because the future of our sacred stories depends on what we do with them now.